Hopefully streaming our work. It didn't work last. Oh, we're live.
Yeah, we're live.
We are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, of a very special guest. He comes to us from the UK. His name is Stuart Smith, and I saw him on Netflix. I saw him on a documentary titled "Europe's Most Dangerous Man," Otto Skorzeny in Spain. And so I was really fascinated by the subject, and I'd heard a little bit about Scorzeny's name just as my interest in World War II. But Stuart's an expert on Skorzeny. He wrote this book titled Otto Skorzeny, The Devil's Disciple, published 2018. Terrific book with 42 five-star reviews, so it's very well received on Amazon, so people can go check that out. But Stuart's going to talk more about that. So Stuart Smith, are you there?
I'm there. Yeah, hello. Glad to be here.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who may not have heard your name, can you talk about your background and what led you to write this book, Otto Skorzeny, The Devil's Disciple?
Sure. An accident, really. I studied history at university, modern history included, but not exclusively. So certainly not the end of the Second World War in any great detail. But then I became a journalist. I was a business journalist, a specialist. I edited quite a well-known marketing magazine in the UK. And after I left that job as editor, done it for 20 years, I set up my own blog, became a consultant. And one day when I was working with another of my colleagues from the same magazine, an earlier editor, we were putting stuff together, and a submission came in, and it was a strange submission. It mentioned this character called Otto Skorzeny, who I'd barely heard of, and I had a pretty good outline knowledge of what happened in the Second World War, who had apparently rescued Mussolini. This man was a former, very well-known creative director in a UK advertising agency. And what he was trying to do, I suppose, was, it came across as slightly pretentious, but interesting, was to say that there are different kinds of creative. You don't just have to be good at artwork or film. And in his sphere, Otto Skorzeny was highly creative because he thought of the vertical axis, as he called it, when rescuing Mussolini from imprisonment in the middle of Italy in 1943. Some of which was true. And I thought, let's have a look at that. That's almost too good to be true. Was he such a so-called creative genius in military terms? And when I looked at it, I discovered he had indeed participated in the expedition to release Mussolini from captivity, but that there was an awful lot of controversy about him. A lot of people, including those who served with him, said he hadn't. He was there, but someone else actually dreamed up the plan to rescue Mussolini. And then I started looking at the rest of Otto Skorzeny's career, and the one consistent thing about it is he's never without controversy. Everything he did attracted attention, some positive, not always though. And there are a number of events in his military career, which I then touched on. And then I discovered that he'd had rather a good war ultimately, because he'd escaped justice, and we can go into what justice might have been later, and lived the what you might call the life of Riley, which did include it did include a mansion house in Ireland eventually, but mostly it was in Spain between 1950 and 1975 when he died in his bed.
Right. I mean, he's just an incredible character, like how he skirted being involved in so many things, so many operations, how he skirted justice for all those years. People say maybe he wasn't as smart, but reading your book, he got through so many things. So maybe for people who haven't heard the name Otto Skorzeny, who is it? What's his background, and how did he become involved in World War II?
All right. Well, up to the early part of 1943, you might say it was a study in failure in a way. He was born in 1908 in Vienna, in the sort of what you might call the crepuscular radiance of a fading empire, 54 million people. To middle-class parents, his father was a successful master builder who'd also been, he'd fought in the First World War, or at least he was in the Army Reserve. And his mother also came from a military family. The Skorzeny name, in fact, comes from something like Scorcene, which is a place in Pomerania, in Prussia, in fact, but centuries back. So they had eventually settled in Austria, but they were established folk. He had an elder brother who was 8 years older than him, born in 1900, Alfred, who was an engineer and his father was like Scorcene, fascinated about technology, but we'll come to that in a little while. This sort of fairly idyllic middle-class life was shattered very soon by the First World War. Austria-Hungary soon, well, not soon, but it did collapse within 3 or 4 years. The empire imploded on itself. And what was left after 1919, this Treaty of Saint-Germain, which is appended to the Treaty of Versailles, imposed on the beaten Central Powers by the Allies, the Western Allies, was a very truncated country with lots of unemployed middle-class folk, industries that didn't work, either the factories were on the Austrian side or the raw materials on the Austrian side. What had been a free trade area was now anything but. And the Skorzeny family, together with most middle-class Austrians of the time, found it very, very hard. In fact, there's a quote somewhere in one of the books about Skorzeny. He said that he didn't taste butter until about 1923. It was that bad. And we've heard all the proverbial stories about wheelbarrows in the Ruhr in 1923 when the French army occupied the West Bank of Germany. Well, it's pretty much the same in Hungary. What would have bought a small house in 1913, 1914 would just about buy a postage stamp in 1923. It was that bad.
Right. So he had grown up kind of in penury. He had said his dad told him, this is actually might be good for you to grow that way. So they're my sense was the family was really concerned about their financial status. And so was he. So he's trying to make a living. I think you said he started a business doing gutters or something up until the war started. So how did he get involved? I mean, as an Austrian, right? So how did he get involved in the whole Third Reich war effort?
Right, it's quite a jump. He wasn't a political young man, but he was a sportsman. His father clearly had some resources he kept back because he was able to send him to university, Vienna Technical University, where he studied engineering. But what he actually did with most of his time, although he did pass his exams eventually, was, well, he was a massive young man. He was about 6'4", very, very athletic, as you can see from the photographs of him. And what he mostly spent his time doing was drinking and sword play. And what I mean by sword play is there was a very established institution. It wasn't unusual in Austrian or German universities of the time, of these what you might call very mannered combat duels with sabers. They were called Schlager, the sword. And the concept was called mensur. It originated in the post-Napoleonic War period, and it was a sort of a ritual, a rite of passage of certain, not everyone in universities did it, but certain macho young men. And the idea with this, and it's important for later on here, I think, the idea of this was to show your unflinching bravery, because although the rest of your body was protected, your face wasn't. And almost anyone who was anyone with one of these swords had the scars to prove it. And Otto Skorzeny was particularly, well, he was insanely brave, as will become apparent in various episodes, but he was certainly showed it at university. He fought an unusual, most students might have fought, I don't know, 3 or 4, depending how long their nerve held. But he fought, I think it was 14 of these bouts over 3 years or so. And in 1928, after he'd been at the Vienna Technical University for 2 years, he got unlucky and he was sliced down the left side of his face all the way to the jaw, which is how he got one of his nicknames, among the Americans anyway, of Scarface. This was sealed up without any anesthetic. It was just done with carbolic.
Right, they just stitch it up right there. Get some
stitch it up just there, yeah. And you went home, and then you came back. Well, if you were him, you came back for another one. He fought another 4.
And there is a picture of him online. You can see it with the cut on his face, and they're wearing kind of like a guard for the neck, a metal guard. Right. It looked very rough, but yeah. But it shows kind of his sensibility of being in a man's club. You're right, and it lays that groundwork with fearlessness and kind of bravado that he would.
The ultimate machismo man, yeah, with the athleticism to prove his point. But he liked to say later on, even though he was kind of apolitical before he went to university, that the saber play, well, he taught him what he called the knowledge of pain, how to take it as well as give it. But he was also quite keen on this idea, almost chivalrous idea, that when you went for the enemy, you went straight for the head. You didn't waste time with the body. Decapitate your enemy. And this was one small idea, I think, behind his decapitation missions later on when he was doing military service. So it was something that a rite of passage, yes, but something that left a lasting impression on him.
Right. So he's part of these men's club. He also likes the speed race. I think he was involved in kind of automobile racing too. So you kind of have that daring. And then how did he get involved in war effort?
Okay, well, this is where we come to the politics. These student clubs, dueling clubs, were in origin very right-wing anyway, and they've become more so with the disgruntlement after the First World War with Austria as a rump state. It seemed to be going nowhere. It's in the hands of coalitions who couldn't rule the country properly. And the army, which was very small, had to rely on a large number of paramilitaries. The most famous paramilitary organization in the 1920s was the Heimswehr, the home force, really, that's what it meant. And these students were affiliated to that. So in their spare time, they could go out beating up gangs of communists. There's virtual civil war in Austria in 1927, 1928. But a pattern began to develop, and Scorcene moved towards the Nazi party. He was originally part of the Heimswehr, which, yes, was right-wing, but it wasn't affiliated to the Nazis in Germany. In the early 1930s, when the Heimswehr leader made a fatal political mistake, he decided to join government, and he dropped the essential stipulation for a lot of these paramilitary students, if you like, of what was called Anschluss. That meant, there was a very technical term, which meant simply that Austria would be joined with Germany. There's a great deal, I think this is quite an important point on why so many young Nazis felt justified in what they did in the early days anyway. There's a great deal of resentment after the Treaty of Versailles had imposed what was seen as a very skewed settlement on Europe. I mean, it talked about self-determination, meaning that, you know, peoples of one language and one culture should fit together, but it seemed to be skewed so that Germans never won out. That was why Austria was so small, why Hungary was so small, because they were the beaten powers. The only way it became increasingly obvious that Austria had any kind of future was to join up with Germany again. And Adolf Hitler, from certainly 1930 onwards, seemed to be the future for a lot of these people. Now, the Nazi Party itself, where the Heimswehr had put aside Anschluss as a policy, and certainly the Austrian government didn't believe in it. The Nazi Party adhered to it very fiercely, but it was banned. It was banned after essentially it assassinated Dollfuss, the Austrian chancellor, and so it was banned from 1934 onwards. Now, by that time, 1932, Scorcene had joined the Nazi Party. He thought it was dynamic. It had lots of easy solutions that appealed to him. And in 1934, he joined the SS, the elite Nazi organization. I should say something here about what the SS meant in those days. It was conceived by Himmler and Heydrich, Reinhold Heydrich, in the late 1920s, early 30s, as a sort of Praetorian Guard around Hitler and his Gauleiters, but it was a lot more. And there was a sort of separate organization in Austria, which it was essentially a middle-class intelligence police organization, intelligence gathering. So it would be very much smaller than, say, the typical, well, certainly smaller than Nazi Party membership, and much, much smaller than the Nazi Party storm troopers, the SA or brown shirts. Proverbially, the SS were called the black shirts, which was actually only true during the 1930s. They changed the uniform later. But at the time, for ease of distinction, that's what happened. So Scorcene joined this elite organization. And in it, nearing the top, and he was top dog after 1936, was someone called Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a real brute. I mean, he was sort of 6'7", even taller than Skorzeny, even bigger, granite-faced colossus. And
the same scars too, right? Same scars on his face. And they're all from Austria. So Hitler, Kaltenbrunner, Skorzeny, all Austrian too.
Yes, yeah. I haven't really mentioned another thing that's from Austria. Kaltenbrunner was unusual for a lot of Nazis we might meet in this conversation. He was actually a lawyer by tradition. His father was a lawyer, and I think his father's father. But he'd actually met Skorzeny socially. I think they knew each other. They probably met because they're at different universities and they were involved in these student duels. But Skorzeny was certainly, he liked to conceal this later because, after all, Ernst Kaltenbrunner became the head of the Nazi security apparatus, the RSHA, eventually, from 1943 onwards. And he was a war criminal, absolutely no doubt about that. And Skorzeny liked to see himself as a sort of clean, apolitical soldier, though we might differ about that. So this idea, this relationship with Kaltenbrunner in his memoirs is very suppressed. It is mentioned, he doesn't completely shy away from it, but you don't get the impression they were very close. But
right. I mean, they all kind of distance after the war. They try to distance themselves from the bad guys. But there's a picture. I've seen a video of Hitler with the two huge guys, Kaltenbrunner and Skorzeny, walking in tandem. I don't know where it was from or what year it was, but it's really remarkable to see all those three guys together, considering what happened during World War II.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the magic moment for Skorzeny, where he becomes a really committed, useful pair of hands to the Nazis, is 1938 and the Anschluss operation, where Hitler essentially stages a coup d'etat and overthrows the Austrian state. I mean, Skorzeny at that point, he's gone through university, he's got a degree. It doesn't add up to very much because there aren't many jobs. So he becomes a mechanic in a depot. Not many people have cars at that time, so it's a bit more prestigious than it is today, perhaps. But nevertheless, he then graduates to a scaffolding company, a building company actually, but it specializes in scaffolding. And he's a sharp practitioner because he marries the boss's daughter, who's called Gretel Schreiber, and gets a share, eventually a major share in the business. And he continues in some way to be associated with it until 1945, when shall we say, force majeure took over. But he divorces this young woman who was, I think, only about 19 or 20 when he married her. And after 3 years, and he marries someone else, an aspiring actress called Emmy Linhart, and we may hear of her, soon enough. So he's in the building trade, but in his spare time, what he's doing is he's participating in something called the Deutsches Turnerbund, which is a gym club. And these gym clubs, athletics clubs in Austria, were below the radar in the sense that they were perfectly legal, but everyone knew they were actually operated by the Nazi Party. So come the day when Hitler's threatening to invade, Skorzeny is, if you like, on the inner ring, and he's part of the crowd, although he denies it in his books. He's part of the crowd outside the Chancellor's building, calling for him to resign. And it's a very threatening experience, a sort of ring of, he wasn't in uniform himself, I believe, but he was wearing a ski coat. But there were plenty of black shirts and brown shirts around. And he plays this cameo role, which points the way to the future. He's the Chancellor at around about midnight on I think it was the 13th of March, 1938. He finally buckles to the pressure and he resigns. Kaltenbrunner's in there because he's unofficially head of the SS at the moment. He's part of the investment of the Chancellery. But there's a problem because the president, who's called Miklas, refuses to give in. And this could be very embarrassing for Hitler. It's a half-cocked coup d'etat. He doesn't really want to have to actually use the tanks assembled outside the armored vehicles and so on. He wants it to be a smooth, seemingly civilian affair where the chancellor's just given up, the president's given up, and Hitler takes over. So what happens is, and we're not quite sure who gave the order, but I think indirectly Kaltenbrunner himself told Scorcene, because he happened to be around and he happened to have access, because as you said earlier, he was very much into motorsport, which was another Nazi-sponsored business. He had access to a car, and he and a few of his mates raced to the residency of the president and effectively burst in. And the way he tells it, he was there as a mediator because he was worried that the guy would get murdered, which would not be a good look for Hitler or anyone else for that matter associated with the Nazi Party. They wanted him Miklas to leave peaceably. But what actually happened was he went in there. Miklas said later that actually he feared for his life, and so did his wife, because Skorzeny actually grabbed him as if to arrest him. And Miklas had a presidential guard led by someone called Lieutenant Biersack, who testified much the same thing, that in fact Skorzeny was much more aggressive than he portrayed himself. But nevertheless, the thing ended peaceably, and Miklas could see the way things were going. There was no way out, so he gave in. And I think somewhere in there, Skorzeny had done it. He wasn't armed. He himself wasn't armed, though he'd had soldiers' rifles pointed at him as he came up the stairs to arrest the president. The overall take from it, as far as the leading Nazis were concerned, Kaltenbrunner in particular, was he'd mission accomplished. He'd been a useful pair of hands, and that was stored for later. Footnote in history, but you can begin to see the style. Insanely brave, dashes up the stairs, not armed. He's so self-confident that he'll somehow sort the situation out, and he does. He does. I lost your sound.
Let me unmute. Sorry. You state that in your book. Like, it's really interesting that this is the groundwork for future things that he's involved in, being at the center of a thing, kind of bluffing his way into, or just manhandling it through sheer moral authority or something like that, where shots aren't fired.
Self-belief, anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, and I think that pulls it off. So you see that groundwork leading into World War II, so this is like the first of many. I mean, Skorzeny's he's almost like a Zelig or something, where he's at pivotal events in World War II, like an observer, like it's just a remarkable historical figure. So what happens after the Anschluss?
Okay, so effectively he gets married to Emmy Linhart, and he has a one child daughter, but on the very day she's born, more or less, in February 1940, he's called up. He's tried to join you can imagine, given his political inclinations, he's very keen to fight for his country, for Adolf Hitler and so on. He tries to join the Luftwaffe because this is the romantic art service. It's full of new, leading edge technology. And most of those involved, they've only learned to fly. They're very young. They've only learned to fly in the recent past. They're usually, because they're younger, more ardent Nazis than those in the army, who are going to bear the brunt of the war, of course. But he's chucked out, in effect. I mean, he must have known when he tried to join the Luftwaffe. He was 31. He was too old for it, and he was too big to fit in the cockpit of an ME 109. Going back. This goes back a bit to the Mensur business. Here's Skorzeny, the sort of lone gladiator type, and he loved the idea of being able to get into aerial combat, but it just wasn't for him. So he did the next best thing. He joined up, as I say, more or less he went to serve more or less the day his daughter was born, Waltraud, in February 1940. And you had to sort of start. You had to start on it's a very strange organization, actually, the Waffen-SS. It was the armed part of the party, but it had only just come into being, certainly as the Waffen-SS. There were armed units of the SS, and there were in fact 2 regiments before the war broke out, and it had to be quickly expanded. So they were looking for a lot of people like Skorzeny, and a lot of professional people actually joined up. it expanded hugely fast. It wasn't particularly well disciplined at the beginning because of the massive intake. There were a lot of people who came from what was called the Allgemeine SS, which was the general SS, which meant basically that they were snoopers, they were policemen or spies in terms of their training and usefulness to the Nazis. There were also even concentration camp guards. The organization was that desperate, but to get the numbers, to get up to 100,000 or so, they'd only been, I don't know what they were, a couple of thousand or so fully armed, fully trained soldiers at that point. So it was a nascent organization, but it had lots, from his point of view, of potential. And it was very unorthodox in its approach to fighting. He joined a Waffen-SS regiment, which became known later on as Das Reich. It was called the SS Division Reich to begin with, which it eventually operated in Russia. But initially, what he was a technical officer, which was seen as a sort of, in terms of the military hierarchy, a cut below being a field commander, which I think he aspired to be, but never actually became. He served mostly in tank depots, sort of sorting out armored vehicles and refitting tanks for the armored SS divisions. He served in France. He did serve relatively actively, well, albeit in a rear echelon position in the war with Yugoslavia in April 1941, which lasted all of 11 weeks, in which he took a lot of prisoners, but more by luck than judgment, I think. And I think this probably gave him a very the war in Yugoslavia was perfect blitzkrieg. Hitler was trying to, as people only realized later, Hitler was trying to protect his western flank for the upcoming Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, despite the fact that Germany was in an alliance with the Soviet Union at the time. So Scorceny's next post is actually on the in the Reich division, and he's riding point in the spearhead. It was called Army Group Middle or Center, which attacked after June 1941. It attacked Moscow, and all went very well in the initial weeks, and they got to Minsk and they got to Smolensk, and they seemed to be in fighting distance, certainly well before Christmas. And then the weather began to change and the Russians began to change. And this is where he actually acquired his first medal, which was the Iron Cross Class 2. He was cited for actually rescuing an armored vehicle in what was called the Yelnya bridgehead, which was, the idea was that outside Smolensk, which was putting up a stiff resistance to the German advance, the Germans were going to outflank the Russians. Scorceny got into this bridgehead, and then things started to go disastrously wrong for the Germans. It was partly the sort of very, very heavy storms in November, the worst winter, some said, in 100 years. It was certainly minus 30 at times. So the whole of the German army, the armored part of it, certainly was reduced to a crawl. The Luftwaffe couldn't take off. Fuel froze. Suddenly, it turned from a blitzkrieg to a war of attrition. At the same time, Stalin's greatest bluff of all, probably, he pulled 18 divisions from the Eastern Front. So there was no real protection against the Japanese should they attack him. But he calculated right, and the Russians just proved far superior at winter war. The Germans were forced to pull back, and it was absolutely horrific for people who were still, well, just to take one instance, fighting in summer uniforms in many cases. In this instance, Scorceny stuck in the Yelnya bridgehead, was bombarded all around. His regiment was not unusual for Waffen-SS regiments, which stood their ground. It was absolutely pulverized, huge casualties. And he himself was afflicted by two things. One was a shrapnel wound to the back of his head, which finally saw him taken back to Berlin. But He'd also had a nasty attack of colitis. So actually, he wasn't on the Russian front for that long. He was withdrawn in January 1942. And that meant he was back into depot service, sorting out the next new range of panzer tanks for Waffen-SS divisions, Mark IV Panzers, Tiger Ones, whatever. And he became very, very depressed. His father died about that time. So 1942 was not a good year for him. And he was seriously wondering about what his future was going to be. And then he gets what you might call the phone call, the thing that's going to completely change his life.
Right. And so that changes him from this frontline soldier to kind of the commando type person. Can you talk about that transformation and how that happened?
Yeah, I mean, as you will have gathered by now, he had no special penchant for commando work. He had the temperament, in some ways anyway, the extreme individualism, the ability to think on his feet for himself, if not for the people around him. But he wasn't actually seen as instant commando material. What had happened was that, Germany was now even somewhere, Hitler and Himmler must have been beginning to appreciate was that Germany was losing. I mean, after Stalingrad, after and that summer Kursk, the German army was incapable of taking the conventional army, the Panzer army, the ground attack aircraft, the backbone of Blitzkrieg and the Prussian military tradition of the time, was failing. And Hitler had this meeting with Himmler in Berchtesgaden, the Berghof, at the end of March 1943, in which it was the discussion point was really, well, it's time for us to turn to what the Germans called Kleinkrieg, guerrilla warfare. We'll do anything we can to stop the advance of the Soviet army. But what are we going to do? There was no. The British have been outstanding at this kind of warfare because for the last 2.5 years or so, basically they've been losing the war. But the Germans did admire some of the things they'd done. They'd had spectacularly successful commando raids like the one on Saint-Nazaire. And also there's something that came up a lot in Scorceny's own assessment of the situation, something called Operation Flipper, which was a November 1941 attack by British commandos, which were ultimately under Lord Mountbatten at the time, combined operations, Laycock as well. They tried to do was very much a Scorcene type operation. They tried to kill Rommel in his Benghazi headquarters. Rommel, of course, led the Africa Corps at the time. So they launched this surprise attack in November 1941. It was an amphibious attack because Rommel's headquarters were quite near the coast in North Africa. It failed. It failed abysmally. I mean, the leader of the operation, Lieutenant Colonel Keyes, was killed, and the Germans managed to capture several of the participants who were wearing German uniforms, which was against the rules of war at the time. Come back to that as well.
Right.
What he admired was the fact that the British get up and go. This asymmetric warfare. It was obviously a pattern of something which could have succeeded. The fact of the matter was, Rommel wasn't there at the time. The intelligence was wrong.
So you see this. You see the Germans looking and seeing what the British are doing, and that gets implemented in. When Italy,
right. So Himmler says to Hitler, in essence, well, why don't we? The SS has something like that, and the reason why the SS up to this time hasn't had anything like that is because there's basically a deal between Hitler and the top of the Nazi Party with the army, which is essentially Prussian aristocracy. It's elite. They fight the war. They deal with external security and internal security in the form of the RSHA, which, as I said, it was led by Reinhard Heydrich until he got himself assassinated in Bohemia in 1942, and then by Ernst Kaltenbrunner later on. They dealt with internal security in all forms. Most notoriously, of course, Kaltenbrunner was in charge ultimately of the Gestapo, but there were other repressive forces available. So Himmler's point to Hitler was, well, we need to develop our own. And in fact, there was a small organization, SS Commando force of merely 200 or 300 troopers, actually mostly NCOs, who'd been turned into a unit, which was run by something called Ausland SD, which translated means the SS Foreign Intelligence Service, run by someone called Walter Schellenberg. And the idea was that resources would be put into this, the forces could be built up, and the SS could have its very own toy. But what the message that went out was, and the one that Otto Skorzeny received, was that they were looking for a technical officer, which he certainly was, an engineer, to lead this new force, which he knew nothing about. Very good reason that no one else did either. So he applied for the job, and it was mediated by someone called Hans Juttner, who was actually the sort of administrative head of the Waffen-SS. He went for the interview, and miraculously easily, he got the job. The surprising thing about the job, which had the title leader of SS commandos, but it commanded he only acquired the rank of a captain, which in SS terms was called an SS Hauptsturmführer. He's only a captain, yet he was leader of SS commandos. What did this really mean? Well, he soon found out when he met Schellenberg. Schellenberg was really a spy master, and the organization which Skorzeny was going to be leading was called something called AMT-6S. Now, AMT was the name, German bureaucracy here, was the name of the organization. There were 7 of these organizations. AMT means department, basically, or division. 7 of these organizations under Kaltenbrunner's ultimate authority. AMT-6 was the Foreign Service, and AMT-S was, as Skorzeny thought, AMT Sabotage. In other words, the commando unit. Actually, the S stood for Schule. What Schellenberg was doing was he was trying to recruit someone who'd straddle the two things. He'd helped to recruit spies, but he'd also run a sort of part-time commando outfit. And this was not what Skorzeny wanted at all. He wanted action. He was, the incarnate assault force type, the man of action. And he was so depressed by this that he talked to his friend Karl Radl, whom he co-opted as his adjutant, even though he's only one rank below him as a lieutenant, SS lieutenant. He talked to him and said, well, this is really awful. I hate Schellenberg. He's such a sort of suave smoothie. And he's forcing me to run a spy network. I'm not fitted for that at all. Where are all these commanders? There was a small commando force, as I said. It had actually been put together from scratch by Schellenberg about a year previously. It was commanded by a Dutch officer, SS officer called Van Bussen. And its original purpose was, in fact, an aborted campaign to counter-invade Ireland. When America came into the war, there was a real fear in Nazi Germany that neutral Ireland, which of course was very important because it wasn't that neutral, it was Nazi-leaning, and they allowed Nazi U-boats to take, they had access not to the ports, but they could lurk about outside. So the idea was that this force would actually help with a sort of coup de main. And in fact was attached, it had IRA contacts, but it never happened. Operation Osprey, I believe it was called. So this was the kernel force that Skorzeny was given. He was given no real brief on what he was supposed to do. I mean, Kaltenbrunner personally wasn't remotely interested in commandos or what they could do. He was all about state repression. And he just simply said to Skorzeny when they had an interview, well, just get on with it. And Skorzeny said, well, get on with what exactly? I mean, Schellenberg seems to want me to run a spy school, and I'm not planning to do that. So it's as crude as this. Kaltenbrunner said, well, study the British. They seem to know what they're doing. And that's what he did.
Right. And I mean, it was pretty fascinating. Like, they ran tons of operations. There were just so many operations for somebody who didn't start. I mean, They were Operation Peter. There's all, and he was just involved in so many things. Can you talk about how the Mussolini situation happened and how that added to Scorzeny's fame?
Yeah, when Scorcene joined the organization, Schellenberg was running an operation in Persia, as it was then called, really. And this was immensely important for the Allies because it was essentially a railroad for all sorts of supplies coming on stream from 1942 onwards, when, of course, the Americans were in the war, sending all their sort of Sherman tanks, planes, and jeeps up to the Russians via the Gulf of Persia. So the idea was that the Germans would attempt to ambush this railway by supplying tribesmen in the south of what's now Iran. Scorcene had little to do with this. He acted as a recruitment agency, and although it was a good idea, it was badly run. I mean, the SS were not the right. Let's say they hadn't got the right psychological frame of mind to mount such an operation. They didn't really know what they were doing. It looked like everything was going to a dead end, and then the Mussolini event happens, and it's an existential emergency for the Nazi state, the Third Reich. And for this reason, Mussolini had been losing the war. The Allies had successfully invaded Sicily. They were known to be about to create a bridgehead. It turned out to be Salerno in mainland Italy. The fascist council, which nominally underpins Mussolini's absolute rule, managed to put through a vote of no confidence, effectively deposing him. And then the king of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, was actually a very powerful figure behind the scenes, staged a coup d'etat. He put someone called Marshal Pietro Badoglio, in charge, and he tried to sue for peace with the Allies. Now, this wasn't going to wash in itself, because back in early 43, I think January 43, there was an accord in Casablanca between Roosevelt and Churchill, which effectively said that there is going to be is unconditional surrender. Under no circumstances will Germany or any of its allies be able to put down conditions if they surrender. But the king and Badoglio thought, well, look, if we use Mussolini as a hostage, then maybe we can get terms. And so they basically kidnapped him and moved him around the country with the help of the Italian military secret service, SIM. And he was guarded by Carabinieri, and there were 3 or 4 staging posts for this. It was quite cleverly done, but Hitler was absolutely determined to get him back. There was a sentimental, so surprising to hear anything said about Hitler's sentimentality, but there was a sentimental side to this. I mean, Mussolini had been his mentor in a way, the first fascist leader, first effective fascist leader anyway. But mostly it was a strategic consideration, because the Italians, they hadn't exactly had a glorious record in the war, but there were an awful lot of garrison troops all over the Balkans, allowing a lot more German troops to be deployed in the Eastern War, which was going badly. So the last thing Hitler wanted was to actually have to occupy Italy with lots of troops he couldn't afford, probably against a very hostile backdrop. But he couldn't leave it as a vacuum either, because it would be an easy win for the Allies. There'd be no resistance, Rome would fall, then they'd roll up the peninsula. So somehow he had to find Mussolini, and he had to get Mussolini back alive and install him in a new fascist republic, which is eventually what he did. Right. The problem was no one could find him for about between, I think it was July the 26th and the beginning of September. There was some leads, some false, some good, but they didn't actually find out for sure what he was until the beginning of September 1943.
And what happened when they found out where he was? Like, I think initially he was taken to an island south of Sardinia. So they had him and they were moving around, and Skorzeny and these other intel characters were trying to really find exactly where he was, right?
Okay. So this is the turning point in Scorzeny's career. This is where the leader of SS commanders really becomes important. And There's no looking back afterwards. But how does he get there? What happens is one day he's in the Hotel Eden in Berlin, because he hasn't really got very much to do, drinking with a former university professor, I believe, and he gets a call from his secretary from a place called Friedenthal, which was east of Berlin, which is where they were set up. That was their commando army camp. And it's to say, look, you better get yourself on a plane. I've been trying to reach you for hours. I don't know what you're doing, but you need to get on a plane straight away to the Wolfschanze, which is Hitler's lair, the wolf's lair in eastern Prussia, because the Führer wants to see you. And you can imagine the reaction. He gets on the phone to his adjutant. So, God, I could have a clean set of clothes for this. But first of all, I have another drink. Drink is a big part of this. Anyway, he gets on the plane, and it's one of these Junker Ju-52. It's a very basic passenger plane, actually, but it's got a VIP lounge. So he sort of amply fuels himself with more brandy on the way, this 3-hour flight to Eastern Prussia. Lands there, is escorted in a black Mercedes car through all the defense emplacements. And he finally arrives at something towards the end of the day. He arrives in something called the tea room, where he's invited to wait for Adolf Hitler to turn up, who, like most heads of state, never turns up early. And he gets a bit irritated with Hitler's, it's not very wise really, but then he's been drinking Hitler's adjutant, who's a man called Gutsche. And because this man fails to pronounce his name correctly, he's vain like that. It's Scorcene. I think Scorcene is how most Germans pronounced it when not educated. So Scorcene. Anyway, eventually he finds himself, he's hauled into a room with 5 others, I think it is. And they're various special forces types, some from the Luftwaffe, maybe one from another Waffen-SS unit, and so on and so forth. And into the room comes Adolf Hitler. Nothing's been explained. And Hitler starts asking these strange questions. Scorcene is at the bottom of the row because he's the most junior. He's only a captain. Some of them are sort of majors and lieutenant colonels. And Hitler sort of starts asking them strange questions about Italy. And they come back with formulaic answers. They know there's a problem down there, but they don't know that Mussolini's been heisted.
And Skorzeny had been down there like for his, he had traveled down there with his wife or something.
Happenstance with his first wife on their honeymoon, and he had been back later. He liked Italy. He had been to precisely the place it turned out that, or very close to the place where Mussolini was finally held captive. But I'll come to that in a minute. In the Abruzzi. So Hitler sort of goes down the line, and he comes to Skorzeny, and sort of Skorzeny stammers, well, what do I think about Italy? Well, I've been there. I know quite a bit about it. That ticks a box for a start, it turns out. So you could talk about this sort of the topography of Italy. But he said, the thing about me and Italy is I'm an Austrian. And Hitler pricks up his ears, because what that really means is it's a coded message. It's going back to the Treaty of Versailles or Saint-Germain. And Austria, don't forget, Hitler, of course, just to emphasize the point, is himself an Austrian. Austria lost a lot of territory in the Tyrol to Italy. Italy was one of the victors. And there's something like, 200,000 Germans living in Italy. And
Volksdeutsch, I think you call it Volksdeutsch.
Volksdeutsch, yes, essentially ethnic Germans. And Hitler had voiced his opinion on this in the past, but because of his close association with Mussolini, he hadn't wished to act, whereas he had acted in places like Romania, which had an awful lot of Hungarians, for example. And Volksdeutsch down there as well, which had been moved back into German areas of influence within the Reich. Anyway, so that sort of seems to trigger something. We don't know exactly why Hitler chose Skorzeny, but basically he said, right, everyone else can go, you're the man for me. And then he explained, everyone else went out of the room, then he explained in a one-to-one to Skorzeny exactly what was going on. He was going to send Skorzeny out as his personal emissary. And they had to get back Mussolini at all costs, and then he explained why. Now, going on around this was a power play, because the SS, this is Schellenberg and Kaltenbrunner and of course Himmler, they were all at the Wolfschanze, coincidentally enough at this point. They knew something big was going on, and they just got their man embedded into a military operation. And what they were trying to do, obviously it was highly important that they succeed, but they were trying to sort of take ownership, if you like, of the raid, because if they could rescue Mussolini, then it was one up against for example, the conventional military secret service, the Abwehr, which was much bigger, but in the view of the SS, incompetently run by Admiral Canaris. So there's a lot of competition behind the scenes, and they were gratified that their man, because they had no control over this, had actually won, if you like, the beauty competition. So the next thing was to send him. He was put under the command of someone called Kurt Student, who was really the foremost airborne troops expert in the German army, or the German Luftwaffe, in fact. Nominally, he was in the Luftwaffe. He was obliged to wear a Luftwaffe uniform during the operation, because strutting around an SS officer might send out the wrong signal to the Italians. They know something was up, and it wasn't very nice. So he's got this access to the leader of the expedition. He's acting as his adjutant. In fact, behind the scenes, Otto Skorzeny is able to tap into Ausland SD, the intelligence, the foreign intelligence service of the SS, and it proves much more efficient than any of the other intelligence services, which are trying to establish the same thing. Where exactly has Mussolini been put? And at the beginning of September, just as things are really deteriorating on the war front, and Victor Emmanuel and Badoglio can't spit it out much longer, the Americans are losing patience, and they declare that Italy has in fact surrendered, which is of course a trigger sign for the Germans to invade, because they don't want a vacuum. Bingo, the police attaché attached to the German embassy in Rome, who's called Herbert Kaplan, discovers exactly where he is. And he's up a mountain in the Abruzzi. It's in fact at a ski resort. It's about 2,200 meters up, and the only way to get to it is apparently by a cable car, because it still exists actually, but nowadays there's a road as well. In those days, there was just a cable car from the nearest village below, which is called a Sergi. And so Scorcene is able to take some of the credit for this, because he's the one who's been scurrying around looking for information. He's been pushing it all the time. Student is a man who's quite worried by his other duties. He's not a political man at all. He lets Scorcene do a lot of the talking at the Wolfschanze, because he's a much better presenter. And which somehow gives the impression that Scorcene is in charge, even though he's not. And Scorcene has, after all, managed to be, he's the one with the bang-on information, thanks to his intelligence service. So Scorceny's student is in Scorceny's debt, in a sense. Also, he's very worried about this operation, because it's wasting his time as a soldier. It's a political issue as far as he's concerned, and a minor one too. I mean, he's got nothing invested in Mussolini personally. What he's worried about is he knows that in a couple of days' time he's going to be involved in the most almighty fight with Italian forces over keeping Rome in German hands. And that's exactly what happens. So there's a picture here building up as Scorcene is able to move into a vacuum, if you like. But the question now, and claim some of the credit, the question now is how are they actually going to get hold of their man? And it's pretty obvious that, well, there are three ways of doing it. There's a ground attack, and then two forms of airborne attack. You can send in paratroopers, parachutists, or you can send them in by glider, paratroopers by glider. And the problem with parachutists, let's dismiss this straight away, is it had never been done at that kind of altitude. They'd be blown all over the place. There's no accuracy. Gliders, pretty dangerous too, especially if you didn't set off first thing in the morning because of the thermals. But anyway, Scorcene was later to claim that he'd foreseen all this, and the only way to do it was a combined operation. A ground force would attack a Scorcene, overpower the Carabinieri guards at the bottom, take command of the cable car. But while they were doing this, a glider force of about 100 men, 10 gliders it turned out, originally 12, would land on the mountain and storm this hotel and rescue Mussolini. Then they join forces. Now, there's a huge amount of controversy after the war, I say, rather than during it, because with Hitler around, no one wanted to argue about who gets first dibs, the laurels for what turned out to be a dangerous but very successful mission. Skorzeny, well, he claimed later on to have been actually involved in the planning of the expedition. This is absolutely absurd. He had no knowledge of airborne tactics at that time at all. He'd been an infantry soldier, effectively. It was someone called Major Moores who had a lot of experience. He'd been involved in there was a famous Luftwaffe commando raid in a fortress called Emil in the opening stages of the German invasion of Belgium in 1940, which was masterminded. It took about 6 months, actually, to mastermind it, the planning for it. It was a sort of prototype of its kind. That had been done with gliders, and there was a similar operation in Crete, less successful, but the Germans did prevail in 1941. And he'd been involved in both of these. He'd also carried out similar operations in the Soviet Union. Immensely experienced, but his problem was that he had a dodgy political record. He'd let it be known it was either defeatist talk or he wasn't too keen on the Nazis. So he wasn't the obvious hero everyone was looking for. Nevertheless, he did all the groundwork on it, and he decided that operationally it was more sound for him to lead the ground force, which was actually bigger, about 250 men in armored trucks and so on, up to a Scorcene. This left Skorzeny in an interesting position. He wangled his way, persuaded Student to let him go with the glider force. There were about 15 SS men. Actually, originally there were 50 brought in the operation, but only 15 participated in the actual glider landing. Most of the people in the gliders were Luftwaffe assault paratroopers. And the way it was supposed to pan out, and Student said this afterwards in his memoirs, essentially Skorzeny, in his view, was just a sort of police escort. He was there to sort of take charge once the Luftwaffe had, shall we say, relieved the Italians of Mussolini. Supposed to take him back to Berlin, but that was about it, really. But it didn't work out like that, because what happened was that the 10 gliders, which finally turned up from southern France that day, they were late. They were late taking off, about 1 o'clock, I believe, which made it even more of a dangerous expedition. Well, morale probably wasn't helped by a so-called pep talk the Student gave, and he just gave it from the shoulder. He said, look, there are going to be a lot of casualties in this, 80% casualties. Nothing like this has been tried before. We had almost no time to put this together, but that's the way, that's what the Führer wants, that's the way it's going to be. So off you go. While they were going, the German glider tactics involved, and this is quite important, in the gliders in strings of 3. And the first 3 had supposedly the commander of the Luftwaffe ground troops, the paratroopers, commanded by someone called von Berlepsch, who's a lieutenant. And in the number 4, that is the beginning of the next, what were called Kette, the next triad of gliders, the Scorcene, with this Italian general that he captured because they thought it would be a good bit of subterfuge, and I'll come to that in a minute. And in the glider behind him was Karl Radl, his adjutant, and lots of other SS paratroopers. Well, they weren't really paratroopers, they were simply troops who knew so much about flying in gliders that they actually had a hearty breakfast beforehand with dismal results. They were that inexperienced and amateurish in a way. So anyway, what's happened is that Skorzeny in part of his intelligence gathering, no one actually knew what was going to confront them when they got to 2,200 feet. What exactly were they landing on? Scorcene had been up in a Heinkel bomber earlier on, and he'd done some intelligence work. The Luftwaffe intelligence officer had fallen out with him because the stereoscopic camera in the plane had failed. This would have given high-resolution photographs of the landing ground. It failed, so this guy, Langut, whose name was, said, well, let's return, mission unaccomplished, we're just going to have to manage somehow. But Scorcene insisted in taking pictures with a less sophisticated camera in very difficult conditions, and he got something which was developed, and it was a bit like, picture of lunar craters or something. It was very indistinct, about 4 inches by 4 inches when they developed it. But this was the only plan they had of a landing zone. And as Scorcene thought, it might be a sort of gentle ski slope. It's nothing of the sort. It's very rocky. Anyway, what happens is that as the gliders are climbing and going towards their target, the first three, containing the most important elements of Luftwaffe force, are forced to turn and re-enter the glider path because they haven't gained enough height over there are sort of hills around Tivoli. And so the second group of three, that's number 4 glider, containing Scorcene, are now in the lead. So by a chance, by happenstance, Scorcene is the first to land in his glider. And they actually land quite well. I mean, there's some discussion as to how much influence Scorcene had over the landing, whether you could actually talk to the pilot through the partition. But anyway, it was said later in General Staff reports that Scorcene had bullied the pilot, making him make a crash landing, when he was actually specifically told not to. They landed without too much damage anyway. And the SS troopers get out very shaken. They've been airsick and so on, stumble around, not having a clue what they're doing really. Then the second glider lands, and the commander in that, the SS commander in that, manages to break his leg. So it's all a bit pantomime at first. They kick down a door at the side of the hotel, but it's not actually an entry to the hotel at all. It's a dead end, and it's just got a radio operator in it. So Scorcene gets out his Luger or whatever and sort of smashes the radio. And then they're looking for Mussolini. They go bound round the back. There's still no one else in sight. None of the other Luftwaffe gliders have turned up yet. And then he has his chance. He sees his chance. He comes around the back, round to the front, and there's Mussolini peering out of the first floor window, saying, "I'm here, and that's it, really. Without more ado, just as the other gliders are landing, these people who should actually be taking command of the operation, Scorcene makes a sort of heroic dash through the doors. He doesn't meet any resistance up to the first floor room where Mussolini is being held, and basically takes over. He does it by bluff. He has said to his troops, "The safety catch is on, no firing. We've got to do this by stealth." And that's what happens.
Right. So he kind of imposes the same thing he did back in Vienna. So it's correct. The same type of thing. No shooting. I'm going to take care of this. So he handles it, and he's the one who leaves with Mussolini too, right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, he's lucky that Mussolini's been watching the gliders through the window come down, thinking, Hitler's come for me after all. Thank God for that. And impetuously sort of breaks away from the guard in the room, and he opens the window and signals to Scorcene, and they say all sorts of things together. But I knew that Hitler wouldn't forsake me, and Scorcene says, "No, I'm here to rescue you and take you back." So it looks like he's sealed up. Berlepsch arrives about that time and secures the perimeters of the hotel and so on and so forth. They disarm all the Italian guards. There are about 120 of them. I mean, you have to say that it was insanely brave of Scorcene. He was very lucky too, but he could have been shot at any time. Technically, Italy was now in a state of war with Germany. So they've been
right. So they took Mussolini and installed him at Salo, right? And correct. Created kind of like a fascist rump state.
Yes, it gave a political fig leaf for at least half of Italy. which meant that didn't have to be quite so many occupying German troops, although there were quite a few around, just to make sure. So, the operation, I would say the operation, in terms of its historical significance, it didn't change the outcome of the Second World War, of course, but it did slightly change its course. Because what could have happened, as I said earlier, was that the Allies could have occupied a vacuum. If the King and Badoglio had had their way, and there'd been a show, Mussolini had been passed over, there'd been a show trial, I think the Allies might have been grateful enough, and they'd opened their doors fully before the Germans could occupy the country. The war in Italy might have been very different to what it was.
Right.
It's taken 2 years.
But it was like that all throughout the Third Reich. There was problems that involved Hungary. So Scorcene gets set in there. I mean, it's really incredible. So these operations that he did lengthened the duration of World War II. At least he helped, at least in some of them, to
I would say that Operation Iker, as it was called, was by far the most important operation. He participated in it, and it did have a material effect on the outcome of the war. And what I'd also say is, whilst a lot of other people were clearly involved in the success of the operation, he did a lot of the legwork. He reinforced, shall we say, Stuart's commitment to get Mussolini out. And of course, he was the one who, when the film cameras came out, because even on a dangerous mission like this, they had a commando company propaganda unit with them. There was a journalist and a cameraman and so on and so forth coming up from below. So he was on film, and this made him look like a superhero.
Right. It was like a propaganda win for the whole Third Reich, right? In Goebbels too. Small
man. Without a sort of charismatic personality. He was just very good at his job. Scorcene, a man with a moustache, stood out like a Hollywood film star, and that of course went out on out to all German cinemas. Die Wochenschau was the weekly newsreel. That was how most Germans got their news. Of course, it was carefully manicured by Goebbels, the propaganda ministry, but it really made him look like a superhero. So, and it was difficult for anyone else to say, oh, yes, but we did this and we did that. And Hitler was convinced it was all about Scorcene. He got his Ritterkreuz, which is need I explain that, the Ritterkreuz?
Yeah, sure.
It was the benchmark of German military achievement at the time. There were higher forms of Ritterkreuz, but the basic Ritterkreuz was something like a Victoria Cross, a little below it, I'd say, in status. But there are by the end of the war, about 8,000 holders, I seem to remember. So he got his Ritterkreuz, which was a coming of age for him. And then he didn't really have to, look back. I mean, Hitler wanted to give him anything he could have. And whenever Hitler had a problem, something that needed to be shut down, these other operations you refer to, Scorcene was often the man first chosen to accomplish the task.
Right. So he was involved in the Stauffenberg plot, or he was there in Berlin. Then he was involved in the operation in, like I said, in Hungary. Then Grief, which the Americans called Battle of the Bulge, he was involved with.
Correct.
I mean, all these different things, very important. And then all the way to the Eastern Front again, really just a important figure for many reasons. And then, I mean, those are all covered in your book. He gets arrested and he spends 2 years in jail. While some of his compatriots didn't make it, he made it through. So, Ernst Kaltenbrunner got hung or shot. I don't know what happened to him, but one of his fellow Austrians. But for some reason, he speeds through.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, what happened was that I need to say something at least about it. It's a very complicated Operation Grief. But if you've seen the film Battle of the Bulge, you'll know that those at the beginning of the German campaign, Hitler's last throw, really, there is a company of German commandos dressed as US servicemen, armed as US servicemen, with US documents, authentic fakes, if you like, driving US jeeps. And they power behind the American lines with the panzers behind them. And the idea is to sow a lot of discord among the Americans, which they actually succeeded in doing. It it's a complicated and in some ways a rather distressing story because a lot of them got killed. But it was a clever ploy, and Scorcene and his officers made it's impossible to keep a secret operation of that size completely off the books. Rumors were going to get out. They might get through to Allied intelligence. So what they quite cleverly did was they allowed the rumors to multiply about what the objective of this it was called Panzer Brigade 150, which involved fake Allied weapons, like converted panzers. There was some genuine captured stuff, but it was very difficult to get, by that stage of the war, which Germany had been losing quite some time, it was very difficult to haul back the right kind of materiel. So the Germans sort of built their own, really, painted a few German Ford trucks in American colors, that sort of thing, turned German tanks into what looked like Shermans, and so on and so forth. And the idea behind it was that the Jeep company, where supposedly everyone on board spoke fluent English with an American accent, far from the case, in fact, would go and sow discord behind the American lines. The idea was that the Germans had to get from their border in the Eiffel Forest, quite near Cologne, to the Meuse bridges. The tanks force, anyway, had to get there within 4 days, and then they would go as far as Antwerp in 7 days. They cut off the 21st British Army and a large part of the American army up there, and it'd be another Dunkirk. That's what Hitler thought. It was crazy, but that's what he thought. And they would capture munitions and petrol dumps, which is very important because tanks crawl along. They can consume a massive amount of petrol and diesel. So they needed to, by that time of the war, they needed to capture stuff as they went along. So Scorcene was in charge of this fast mechanized force. But the interesting part of it was really the commando company of Jeeps, some of whom got captured. And they were full of all these rumors, but they didn't know which ones were correct. And one among them was this idea that the real purpose of the operation was, yes, a breakthrough, but Scorcene and his commandos were going to jeep their way to Paris under the guise of being American soldiers. And then they were going to kidnap the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower. Yeah. This was something that was not forgotten and not appreciated because it made an idiot of the American security detail. Eisenhower was pinned down for over a week from the middle of December onwards, just when he should have been directing operations in the Battle of the Bulge. But nevertheless, they didn't forget it. And payback time came somewhat later. Scorcene eventually surrenders around about 16th of May, 1945. Hitler's dead. He's in the Austrian mountains, but he realizes a guerrilla war is going to be hopeless. The Americans, they make some mistakes with him, actually, because, obviously, as you could see from now, by now, he's a very mediagenic, charismatic kind of person. And it's a high-profile arrest in which he's not exactly beaten up, but he's brutalized a bit. And the media's around, flashbulbs pop. So he's sort of turned himself into a bit of a martyr already. And then comes his trial about 2 years later. This is not unusual, by the way. The Allies spent quite a long time, especially the Americans, who were slow but patient, spent quite a long time interrogating suspect officers. Most officers, including Wehrmacht officers, non-Waffen-SS officers, spent time in jail, but most hadn't committed verifiable war crimes. The question was, had Scorcene committed a war crime? And the answer is, technically, maybe. Because what he'd done with this Jeep commando unit was he'd broken it's a very strange thing, because the war in the East was fought absolutely brutally without any rules, including dressing up in each other's uniforms all the time, firing on each other while in these uniforms. Russia didn't adhere to the Geneva Convention, for example. But in the West, it was fought in a almost more gentlemanly manner. Of course, there were atrocities, of course there were. But the German generals, as well as the Allied ones, liked to fight by the book. And the book was something called the 1907 Hague Convention. And in it was this Article 23, which said basically that, okay, ruses, what we would call false flag operations today. Ruses, camouflage operations were allowed in war, but here's the absurdity of it. You had to, reflecting a more chivalrous age, I think, when you engaged the enemy, you had to rip off your force uniform to display who you were, and only then could you fire at them. And the question was, had these commando company troops in their jeeps, had they at any time actually fired on the Americans without alerting them? Because if so, they could be technically arrested as spies and shot. And that's what happened to about 15 of them.
Right. So they do get shot. And there was also the massacre at Malmedy, I think, was something that they were trying to pin on him too.
Well, there's a lot of detail you can go into with this, but essentially, the man who was the prosecutor in Scorceny's war trial in Dachau in 1947, who was called Abraham Rosenfeld, he had tried to nail Skorzeny previously, together with the whole of the senior part of what was called Kampfgruppe Peiper, which was undoubtedly in some way responsible for the death of 85 servicemen. They said more at the time. 85. This was during a push some days into the operation, which at one time looked as if it might be quite successful. And there's no rhyme or reason why this massacre happened. The American unit was disarmed, and some Waffen-SS troops. We don't know to this day exactly who was responsible, but the army command, led by Jochen Peiper, who was a very sort of dynamic, if ruthless tank commander, was held responsible because they'd issued orders sort of saying, take no prisoners, basically, and some Waffen-SS soldiers had taken it seriously. The question was Skorzeny, who was sort of in the area at the time, but not in the area, was he also responsible? Had he also issued similar orders? Take no prisoners, just shoot them, regardless of who they are, unless they have some asset value, information. And actually, I mean, when I went through the detail of it, it was clear, in fact, that this was a put-up job, that Skorzeny had absolutely nothing to do with the Malmedy massacre. He was nowhere near at the time. There was one reconnaissance jeep that happened in the area of Malmedy by mistake about 3 hours after the massacre happened on the 17th of December, I think it was, 1944. What was going on was it was payback time, really, from Rosenfeld's point of view. These court-martials, they were administered, as the name suggests, under military law, not civil law. You could do all sorts of things. You could, if you were Rosenfeld, anyway, you could stage manage the evidence. You could beat evidence, if you like, out of prisoners, because no one's going to stop you. Hoodlum them, beat them, starve them, all sorts of things. Obviously, you couldn't kill them to get the kind of outcome you wanted, because in the courtroom, the court was made up largely of these sort of field colonel, lieutenant colonel types who weren't actually lawyers at all. Rosenfeld was a professional lawyer, so he knew what he wanted, and he couldn't get Skorzeny in on the Malmedy trial the previous year because he was actually ill. He had another bout of colitis, and he had to have his gallbladder operated on at the time. So this is payback time. So that's why the charge was appended. There's another technical reason why Rosenfeld did it, but I won't go into that now. That was the biggest thing held against him initially, because there was no witness who turned up in time. The charge had to be dropped. But the issue of whether Scorceny's commando company troops had fired without warning while in American uniform stuck for a lot longer. But eventually, he had a very good lawyer called Robert D. Durst, who's from Massary, I think, Springfield, Massary, and he was backed up by someone who actually did have experience of criminal trials, a criminal trial lawyer who I think had been in the DA's office in San Francisco, someone called Donald McClure. A good team, and they learned from the mistakes of the previous trial, where basically people have been able to proffer their own defenses. And what happened was that, all the German lawyers suggested a cutthroat defense. So everyone blamed everyone else, and all the defendants went down. Some were condemned to death, although that was reprieved. Some, to as little as 10 years. So this was not a good outcome, and Durst could see that the way to get through this trial was to impose a single narrative on what actually happened and choose a leader. And Scorcene was the obvious leader. There were 10 defendants altogether in this trial. So he was selected as their spokesman. So he had quite a harrowing time being cross-examined, and he seems to have performed quite well under pressure. But he was sort of stage managed by Durst. And what Durst did, and this was almost an accident, but not quite, he realized that you couldn't really get away with this charge that easily, but you could almost surf it by pointing out, if you could find the evidence, that the Allies had done just the same thing.
Right.
The 1907 convention was put together at a time when there weren't tanks, airplanes, or indeed really commandos in the modern sense of the word. And it was out of date, and the British and Americans had done similar things. Hitler was convinced this was the justification for Scorceny's type of undercover operation in the first place, that the Americans had done just the same at Aachen, which was the first city in Germany to fall in September, I think it was, 1944. In fact, there was an OSS unit that had cloaked itself in German uniform and shot at German machine gun posts. It subsequently emerged, so there was some justification. So what Durst, the defense lawyer, did was he found this man called Tommy Yo Thomas, Wing Commander Tommy Yo Thomas, who was a war hero, a British war hero, who had assisted in an operation called Asymptote in 1944. The idea was to wear German uniforms. They're actually SD uniforms, not military ones, but it didn't matter. The operation didn't come off. It was a bit theoretical, but basically in the witness box, Yo Thomas was very sympathetic to Scorceny's position. And when asked by the defense counsel what he would have done if the operation had gone ahead and they'd been challenged by German sentries, so they were trying to rescue a leading member of the French resistance in Rennes, he said, well, we would have bumped them off. No question. We'd have just shot them and disappeared with our prisoner. So that it wasn't very good. As a legal argument, it didn't hold up very well, but it made a huge impression on the judges and everyone. There were other aspects of this trial, of course, but everyone that he was all the defendants were unanimously acquitted. Yeah,
unanimously acquitted. Right, Stuart. We're at almost like an hour and a half.
Oh my God!
I mean, there's a lot more in this book. I mean, he had 25 years of life after World War II with all kinds of shenanigans and intrigue and subterfuge. I mean, his life was really, and he had an incredible life. I mean, it really just, there's no other way to say it. I mean, the devil's disciple, I think, is fitting, not really, he wasn't a saint by any stretch of the imagination, but the fact that he skirted out of so many predicaments is really something else. Where's the best place for people to get this book, Otto Skorzeny, The Devil's Disciple?
Amazon. Easily available on Amazon.
Amazon. And do you have a website or Twitter or social media?
I have a Twitter account. There is something called Stuart Smith's blog, which has a few pieces of journalism attached to it. It was partly promotional material, but it's factually based, which would probably give you other aspects of Scorceny. I mean, one thing I did was I looked at the influence Scorceny had on one of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels, Moonraker. You'll find that he plays a part in that. That Drax, the villain, is in some ways based on Scorceny.
I didn't know that. Wow, that's interesting.
I leave you to read that. It's quite interesting, but just a bit of a curio, really.
It is. Well, there are other characters Fleming borrowed from Crowley too. Aleister Crowley was his first one, Le Chiffre. So he probably just found sinister type characters and integrated them in his novels. But this was a true story, an excellent, very well read book, very very thoroughly researched too. So thanks so much for your time, Stuart. Again, the title of the book is Otto Skorzeny, The Devil's Disciple, and the author is Stuart Smith. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
All right, stay there. Hold on.